been existing and they haven't seen the engagement of diaspora organizations just because they weren't focused on that. And since February 24th, diaspora organizations became very visible. Like if you look at the Nova Ukraine, for example, they have evacuated like 25,000 people. They have reached 1.5 people in Ukraine and have fundraised like extensional amounts of money. And they working with Airbnb. So like just think about it, like one diaspora organization has reached 1.5 million people in Ukraine, while humanitarian system as of last week reached 6.5. So they are being noticed. That's why INGOs and cluster, they want to engage because they also see the capacity. The issue of capacity we can discuss because, as we mentioned this morning, many diaspora organizations work for free, and you can't call it work. They're volunteering, they're full-time, but they have huge capacity because they have resources on the ground.
Thanks, Dina. And could you actually, Dina, as a follow-up question, elaborate a little bit more on your role and what is DEMAC doing or trying to do in Ukraine?
So this is a pilot, right? I guess, yes, this is the pilot. So I had previous experience with DEMAC working as consultant, and I guess it was like 5 days when the war started, when Raphaël wrote me and said, like, would you try do this in Ukraine for us? So these are like 3 main components. Let's say first we provide a floor for diaspora organizations, Ukrainian diaspora organizations to cooperate and collaborate. And we have regular weekly meetings online because all of them are spread around the globe. Thank you, COVID, for that, because all of us have meetings online now. Also, we creating link between diaspora organizations and classical humanitarian system because, again, they don't have enough capacity to visit all the cluster meetings. And let's be clear, like I'm visiting all the cluster meetings, do the updates and provide these updates for diaspora organizations. And we split with Daria sometime because, for example, health cluster is taking place at the same time, shelter cluster, for example. So we're trying to get this information and provide all the updates for diaspora organizations. But also we trying to do this on-the-go learning for diaspora organizations about humanitarian system, about humanitarian principles, about the modalities of working of clusters, bringing people from clusters to the meeting. And also sometimes I just did a presentation at the food security cluster about DEMAC and Ukrainian diaspora organizations. So we're trying to be a link between diaspora community and humanitarian system because as it seems, it's quite complicated for both of them to be engaging. So I would say that.
Sorry, just a follow-up question from this morning. And have you seen any example of complementarity or collaboration? What deals come as a complementarity to?
We used to have cluster system has this forwarding system of requests, and we have received some from the clusters, and usually it happens with some of our rapid requests because organizations like UN and INGOs, they have to do some kind of changes to the budgets and whatsoever. So we had a request from the Ukrainian railway, Ukrzaliznytsia. It was forwarded from the health cluster to us, and we forwarded it to Ukrainian diaspora community, and they were following up later, like picking up this request. So I think even the humanitarian system now understand that if you need like very quick reaction and INGOs are not able to respond, they could follow up with DEMAC, for example, asking to forward it further. So yes, I think it's starting to work, but the issue of standards and everything, I think, will be there for some time.
Great, thanks, Dina. So maybe my last question before we open the floor for comments and questions for all the participants would be on the actual lesson learned. We talked about preparedness, partnerships, about resource mobilization, also engagement with institutional humanitarian actors. Is there anything, any lesson learned you think we could replicate in other contexts, or we should kind of take stock in this context of Ukraine, and could be useful for other response and also for DEMAC. Maybe starting with Emily, or Andrii, you were about to start. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one thing we haven't mentioned is also cooperation between Diaspora itself, where we, thanks to DEMAC and our last 1.5 year cooperation, we get to know each other, and that's where also we get this moment where we could help each other in this very fast and very fast development situation of helping to Ukraine. We could communicate to each other very, very quickly, and we already know each other. For example, Diaspora in Poland was very helpful. All our trucks and humanitarian aid is gone through Poland, so we use them a lot for supporting us. And I think it's very big things. Also, there was also issues with the Turkish diaspora and Danish diaspora, where we have a communication on refugees, and we could share our experience and say them like, okay, we can do it in a different way. So there was like intercommunication in between us. I think that's lessons learned. Of course, thanks for being prepared. As I said, Ukrainian diaspora was being prepared for the development of the situation, and it's also thanks to DEMAC, who's been leading these meetings and conference on a monthly or quarterly basis since, I don't know, 2 years ago, right? When we start cooperation, it's allow us to be more united and understand the processes which we were not aware of. So I think that's a good lessons learned.
Thanks, Andrii. Emily, anything to complement?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that, I mean, the role of DEMAC, of course, is to increase coordination. And so I think there was a big push at the beginning to say, okay, like how can we include diaspora organizations in the coordination mechanisms of the formal humanitarian structure? And I think as it's gone on, and it's coming out even here in this conversation a bit, is that maybe integrating organizations into the cluster system isn't always like the right approach, frankly, often because organizations don't have a footprint often themselves in the country where they're responding. And so they're kind of seen outside the system. However, they still have a huge value add. And so there's a huge possibility for organizations to be coordinated and to collaborate amongst themselves. I think for fundraising, for action between countries, for advocacy, I think it's especially in the US, it's been really incredible. And then DEMAC having a facilitating role, I think, between the clusters, and having diaspora organizations leverage their advantage, which is having access to a funding pool that is without restriction, that is, has an ability to be employed quickly and flexibly, rather than saying, we want them to be a functional partner in the clusters. I think the next thing is how do we shift the response now? I think in the beginning it was a lot of a focus on getting things into Ukraine, a lot of in-kind, but also there's a huge pool of money. So how do we leverage the fundraising that organizations have been able to do into something that's a bit more sustainable, is correct for a protracted crisis, and maybe leveraging some of the infrastructure in Ukraine with well-connected markets, with everyone having bank accounts and good kind of social safety nets. How can we bring diaspora organizations along in that conversation that's happening in the formal humanitarian space in Ukraine right now?
Yeah, I would add to that this war and the crisis actually showed that solving humanitarian and social issues is not necessarily like prerogative of humanitarian system or humanitarian NGOs, because in Ukraine so many stakeholders are involved, including the private sector, from the huge corporations to very small entrepreneurs in the field. So it's like something new for the humanitarian sector, but Also, I would say that in Ukraine at the moment, it's so visible, and Patty was actually mentioning this in the morning, that diaspora organizations are so flexible. At the same time, they're so modern. They use technology, and they're working on the, I don't know, agile Scrum and everything. So they are so flexible that humanitarian system is not even able to respond sometimes to that. So I think using all the technology and all this agile, flexible planning is actually a key lesson learned that could be taken even by the system.
Great. Thank you so much to all three of you. So now we open the floor for questions. Yes? Maybe Andrii, you want to just start?
Yeah, we did not mention one big problem, which was the 24th of February. Actually, the international humanitarian system in Ukraine was absolutely paralyzed. Many of the employees of this of international humanitarian organizations and also of the OCHA system were evacuated. Actually, it took almost 3 weeks that they slowly came back into Ukraine, and it took maybe another 3 weeks till they started to work on a bigger scale in Ukraine. In this period, actually, the diaspora organizations provided the basic needs, which was important to actually helping the people to survive the first period. This was with all these trucks and small buses which brought humanitarian aid and food and everything what was needed into the country. That's one thing. The second thing, what I think is very important, is and which we should reflect, is how we can strengthen the implementing partners of the diaspora organizations in the country. It was mentioned already that actually everybody is looking at the same partners and supporting the same partners. I was president of Caritas Ukraine, and this is an organization which everybody wants to work with because they have a network in the whole country, and they are prepared to work with big organizations, but also with diaspora organizations. But we have to think now, how can we widen the network of implementing organizations, how we can enable implementing organizations also to take, to handle and manage funding from institutional donors in Ukraine, and that's something where we can work with DEMAC, we can work with diaspora organizations, and we need expertise and to accompany these organizations in Ukraine. This will be actually the crucial thing if we want to avoid one thing which is very problematic in Ukraine. We are looking into the funding from the OCHA system from the United States. I think it's now about the budget foreseen for the next time is $4 billion. It will be used mainly by the government in an absolutely uncontrolled way. It will be used by some international organizations, and it will not have an impact of the transformation of this country. What we have to build up is the strengthening of the Ukrainian non-governmental sector, actually to build this sector and strengthen it, so Ukraine will be transformed through it. What we saw in the past is Ukraine has a very vibrant civil society, and we have to focus on the civil society because this will be important for the next time. And the last thought, we are talking since years about the nexus of humanitarian aid and development. We also have in mind that we build not only, we should not bring only humanitarian assistance into the country, humanitarian aid into the country, but build also social systems or help to build the social system. We have, for example, one big problem is the home care services for people, displaced people, internally displaced people who went to other parts of the country and don't have any assistance. We have to build up these services. We have to work also on concepts of social policy to transform the social policy system in Ukraine.
Thank you, Andrii.
Thank you so much, Andrii. Maybe we take two,
There
three more
was
questions.
3, I'll forget.
Okay.
Just to reflect. So as for the humanitarian system being blocked, I think it was Patty or someone in the morning who said that diaspora organizations work based on the need, and international actors, they work based on the budget. So why they were blocked during the first 3 weeks is because in 2018 and 2018 they saw the situation in eastern Ukraine as a protracted conflict, and they thought that for the budgets it would be more feasible to move offices from Kiev to Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and Severodonetsk and be present in the field, which is quite logically, but not if you're planning long term. That's why they were blocked there, and they had to evacuate their own stuff. Luckily, for example, UNICEF and UNHCR were evacuating kids from orphanages together with them, but they were blocked just because they were planning based on the budget, not because of the long-term strategy. And for the civil society organizations, I have to say that this crisis actually made humanitarian system in Ukraine change a little bit, because 8 years in a row they had all their coordination meetings in English. Since February they have it in 2 languages already. They have simultaneous translation. So they're trying to engage more with Ukrainian civil society organizations, which they were actually missing a lot during 8 years. And they also make the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund, and this 4 billion appeal is actually for Ukraine Humanitarian Fund as well. And that's how they're trying to engage a lot of organizations. But again, there are issues of standards and humanitarian principles which they are not aware of. So they're spending a lot of time, effort, and money now to let them know about it. And I think the issue of funding of diaspora organizations and localization, like the grand bargain we mentioned this morning. So there's also an issue of policies among international organizations, because when they issue, let's say, a grant competition for nexus or development in Ukraine, they have technical restrictions saying you have to be registered in Ukraine, meaning this is not available for diaspora organizations working abroad. So this is also an issue of advocacy, that in order for diaspora organizations to be able to plan and respond and working with local organizations and to be able to raise capacity of local organizations, these rules have to be changed as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Dina. Hannah, you want to start? Unless you wanted to complement on that. No. Okay.
Thank you. I've got 2 points, or 2 queries, I guess. And the first one comes across from a very particular angle, because I work in disarmament, so I work in the area of mine action in particular. And some of the things that are coming out already with some of our clearance teams is the fact that communities and villages are very cut off. They themselves, as a consequence of the types of engagement that was taking place during the different forces, that villages were essentially booby-trapped or have explosive ordnance, anti-personnel landmines, and anti-vehicle mines placed at strategic locations in and out of villages. And so a lot of the communities that we've been able to are now starting to get the information about or access to is the fact that they couldn't leave. They couldn't leave because they knew that the area was contaminated and that they took a very strong risk of being harmed as a consequence. And they'd been cut off for a long time. And these are some areas similarly which had been cut off from any sort of telecommunication systems or anything else. So my question 1 is, do you think that, or do you find that diaspora communities are able to overcome these types of impediments themselves in a better manner, despite maybe limitations of access, and of course by virtue, diaspora are not in country, and across these maybe gaps around telecommunications and things like that, like where those networks are stronger perhaps than other traditional mechanisms? That's one question. Second one is, it's very difficult to not compare and contrast other crises that have taken place globally and the response that's taken place with Ukraine compared to others in every fashion. And it's a very different ballgame how the humanitarian sector, how global interest, fundraising, everything has taken a very different approach in countries accepting displaced populations into their own compared to Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia. Previous to this, I was working in Somalia, and I look at the comparisons because in Somalia, there is an extremely strong diaspora community, and similar but different in terms of the conflict, has a long history of conflict, which ebbs and flows and fluctuates and is in isolation or in a broader spectrum. And so I do wonder, what is it that you think that has led to such a different response program amongst the diaspora of the Ukraine situation, the Ukraine crisis, versus other crises globally?
I can answer the demining.
Maybe we take a couple more questions, and then Chris. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Joe here. Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
More questions now? Okay.
Yes, we will
Okay,
take
I know
a
there were
couple
so
more.
many already, but sorry, there were so many already, but so two questions. One that pertains a bit to the past, and one that goes more towards the future. I mean, so past first. I mean, and here I mean respect. I mean for the foresight and what I mean the diaspora achieved in a very short period of time, while correctly so, yes, I mean the more formal system was paralyzed, at least in part, a bit on the run, taking stock and getting to terms with the new situation. That said, I mean probably a focus that was very much, I mean the term was being used on stuff, so like logistics and whatever. I guess probably based on guesstimates. I mean, what is likely to be needed? Let's try to get it in. So despite all the very positive and impressive aspects, any reflections on shortcomings? What should have been different? I mean, were you to do it again? Let's hope that will not be the case, ever happen, but in case. Second, I mean, moving forward, whereas a colleague already mentioned, needs are probably going to be changing. Things are going to look different. I mean, we can already foresee with high likelihood that shelter reconstruction is going to be big. So again, it requires different capacities on the ground, but probably also different strategies from the diaspora. So a little bit, what are reflections there? What do you think? I mean, moving forward, what does that call for in terms of organization and approaches? Thanks.
Oh my goodness, there's so many. Please remind me of your questions. So I actually just wanted to first make a funny comment. I guess when I was looking at the Ukraine response, the HRP, so the humanitarian response plan for the response for 2022 was actually released 7 or 10 days before the invasion, which was very poorly timed. Someone should have made the editorial decision to cut that one. But I think it's just a good example of kind of like, it's an important role in the humanitarian response, but a lot of things takes time. And that report was probably based on my engagement with them in the past, a year in the making, and so was irrelevant by the time it actually was released. So that's just a funny observation. On your second point, I think that's and it relates to Chris's point a bit as well, is that I think the next role for Diaspora is exactly trying to bridge that gap on local capacity and building up local NGOs, because I think they do have, incredible advantages compared to other contexts with infrastructure partnerships with the government, just like, I think familiarity with the environment and their experience, a lot of them coming from private sector or other professional organizations where they're able to leverage those skills, but they do need help in terms of how to manage the money they're receiving, how to do reporting, how to make work plans and all of this stuff. And I think that there's a role for Diaspora there, especially for language reasons. I think a similar connection on understanding the local environment, and then also on the fact that it is maybe a more natural transition from donor to like a partnership, more a true partnership than an implementing partner kind of donor relationship. I forget your points. Maybe any other humanitarian agencies or anything. Yeah, and so I did talk informally to some INGOs for this study. None of them wanted to be written in the report because they didn't want to speak on behalf of their organizations, I guess. But let's just say that I think the remoteness is managed, at least from the outside, it seems like through those networks, like passing stuff or sending things on a bus with someone or in someone's personal car. Diaspora organizations and their local partners are totally fine to do that, whereas INGOs are doing that in some cases, but they're not happy to admit it simply because it's outside of what would be expected for accountability reasons for them. And they're only able to justify it really like in the Far East Whereas diaspora organizations are quite willing to do it almost anywhere, which does raise a bunch of other problems like accountability, both to donors and to the communities, and how that, like how aid is being used. But I would say, especially as Ukraine is still in the no regrets response phase, it's acceptable.
Yeah, maybe I will add on that one. I think we're quite open and we're quite ready to work informally. We not in this crisis situation, in a war situation, there is no time to sign kind of memorandums of cooperation or something, right? We work through our network where we can penetrate into the deep. For example, one of the I will talk through examples. One of the good examples where we requested to deliver medicine to occupied territories because there were still people who couldn't leave them, and they need medicine, just to survive. And of course, it goes very informally. It goes through our volunteers. It goes through people who take risk. Of course, it's not like risk just to deliver to the people who are in need. And we are ready for that because that's our response to the war. I would say so.
I would add a little bit, like you remember all the stuff when they said it was Facebook who started the revolution in Egypt. So basically the Facebook is platform for diaspora response in Ukraine. And issue was demining, like if you want an international organizations or representatives of the ministry to go for demining, you should fill in the form. And if you want to, for example, there is Ukrainian Deminers Association, for example, you know them. So I'm from Irpin in Bucha, so they just see a photo in a Facebook that somebody took because he entered his apartment and saw the anti-tank mine, and there was like, how do you call this heavy thing you do in the sport? So this was on an anti-tank mine inside of the apartment. So they just posted on Facebook and the guys come. So that's how diaspora organizations and locals could be very fast because they're using the Facebook, and you just tag a person under the post and they are there, not having all this stuff.
I think the one thing we missed actually is the negative sides or the challenges. So maybe we can all comment on that too, because I do think it's interesting and important. Like certainly there's been a lot of positives, but I think it maybe will turn as the response continues, because a lot of the advantages are first phase advantages. They're not long-term implementation advantages. There are no regrets kind of policy advantages, but now I think the issues of accountability, I think the issues of misuse of resources. I mean, I think working with local governments is great, but I think it was alluded to this morning that sometimes mistakes are made or things go missing. And you're really kind of at the behest of whatever local official you're working with, and not all of them are the same or have the same interests of their community in mind. And there was an immense amount of trust placed in these volunteer hubs. And so there is a huge black market, I think, in Ukraine that is fueled a lot by this stuff. So that will be a huge challenge to overcome, and I think was an initial phase challenge as well. And something switching to like social protection cash response is trying to address. I mean, that's one that comes to mind for me. I don't know about you guys. Other challenges?
Yeah,
negative.
We mainly been working through our network. So in this way, we try to decrease all the challenges. It's not like we deliver, the stuff and then give to the people whom we don't know. It was really through